So welcome everyone to Thinking Space. What a delight for us all to be here, gathering together and talking about telling stories about stories today. And so when we do gather like this, it's important to acknowledge that we meet on Gadigal land as uninvited guests on Gadigal land, and pay respects to elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal people here today. So I have the pleasure of chairing this session, and which will only involve me telling you to be quiet and then invite questions at the end. And Bob is very keen for us to all share our experiences of fiction, telling stories about stories once they've finished presenting. So first up we have Bob, and then June, and then Kurt. So Bob's going to talk about the Hungry Farm.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. Well, I suppose I should just mention how we got to doing this. June and I were having a talk just after her presentation last semester, and we discovered that we both read this book, The Hungry Tide, and we both found it really inspirational. So we thought, well, why don't we have a seminar to talk about how fiction can be, well, inspirational and informative. And then Kurt volunteered to contribute to, because he's had the same sort of feeling about literature. So I inherited this book because I have actually been to the site, so I figured I could show my photos, which I'm not going to do very much of. Okay, so it started with that conversation, and I suppose that the motivation is that, in my case, I've always been, my interests have been in geography, history, and anthropology, which is my main discipline. And I've often been inspired all along in that by fiction that I've read. I've been a bit embarrassed to say perhaps the first one I remember is Beagles in the Cruise of the Condor, which I read when I was about 10 or 11, and it's about the Amazon. But even though it's only one or two chapters talk about the history and so on, I've always been really fascinated. And I actually visited a couple of years ago with one of our PhD students. So that's sort of, kind of how it starts. I should add, I also read a lot of nonfiction, which kind of contributed to the interest as well. Let's start about this one. There's here. I've got to work out how to move it on now. Okay, so this is the Sundarbans, which is a forested mangrove forest area in the Bay of Bengal, and it's shared between India and Bangladesh. And it's an incredible, physically just an incredible area. It's lots of little bays and islands and so on. Every year there's serious flooding as a result of just the ordinary monsoons. Very frequently, I mean several times a year, there are cyclones. And it's so, how would you put it, so active that islands can disappear almost overnight, and then they can pop up somewhere else as the soil sort of gathers. So that's a really kind of spectacular environment to think about. And I think it was 1970, there was a cyclone and a big surge and so on, where something like 300,000 people were killed. Right, and that's one of the lower estimates. So I'd often heard about this stuff, and I remember reading about that at about the time. The other thing that Sundarbans is famous for is very active Bengal tigers, who are reputed to be abnormally hungry for human flesh. And it is true that something like 50 to 60 people every year are killed across the forested area by tigers, who will also swim across the rivers and attack people in villages and so on. Now, that's not a myth. I remember hearing about that years and years ago, and the idea that people were actually wearing masks on the back of their head on the theory that tigers only wouldn't attack someone that they're facing. It turns out not to be true. So, that's kind of the background, but it's just this incredibly volatile environment. So this is not one of my photos. But this is just one of these classic, kind of ideas. People trap the tigers and then release them and so forth. And it's it's a kind of a significant theme. It's a very dangerous environment for the, geographic climatic reasons, obviously very susceptible to climate change. But it's also very dangerous because people go fishing, they go sometimes hunting illegally in the protected areas and protected forests. They go fishing, and there are lots of sharks and crocodiles. So it's a really dangerous place, and people are living very close to the, to the dangerous areas. They're usually fairly poor, so they're very open to the risks and so forth. So what I wanted to talk about, though, okay, firstly, I should say that I knew about the St. Albans, as I said, before I went there, and even before I read the book. I read the book, and then I went to the St. Albans as when I was working for IUCN on a mangrove project. So, when I arrived, I was astonished at how much, everything I'd, had heard about it, and particularly in this fantastic book, actually was true, and I could relate to it almost immediately. Just one of the things to sort of bear in mind here, the road on the left here is actually one of the slightly elevated parts of one of the islands, right? And the difference between that and sort of the lower areas, as on the right, where you see the women actually using the rather murky waters and so on for washing and so on, it's just a couple of meters. So there's a tendency when the floods get serious, or when the tides really rise and so forth, for the poorer people who live on the lower land to be very particularly vulnerable. Okay, now that's important, and that's really described with amazing accuracy in the Hungry Tide, and I think that's it's fascinating when you're when you've read about a place and about it in background, and when you turn up, everything is exactly as you kind of imagined it will, and you don't even, in a sense, need to have the clues and ask questions, because you know what the questions are. So it's a really fantastic concept. So the thing about it was this thrill of the place. It's one of the most spectacular environments I could ever imagine. It's pretty well unique. One of the things that's really, I'll just quickly say something about the book. Amitov Ghosh, who's the author, spent a fair bit of time in the area, and he's got lots of themes that are very recognizable. For example, he's really good on the politics of the St. Albans. This area was pretty well unpopulated, virtually unpopulated up until about the 1920s. And then there were sort of British colonialists in both sides of the border, encouraged settlement for industry, mainly logging, right? Commercial logging, just before you had any conservation. Then, of course, because the areas are highly populated and there's land available, people moved in. So now it's very intensely populated off the actual reserve forest area. So the consequence of that is that there's a really good history of the politics of the area in the book. The book actually deals with the Indian side. I visited the Bangladeshi side. There's a story in this about a massacre that occurred in the 1970s, where following the civil war in Bangladesh, significant numbers of people migrated out of Bangladesh and settled on an island, and then they got into conflict with the forest department because they were living on a land that was reserved for forests, and there was a massacre, right? So that's actually something that historically is really significant, and it's a big part of what's in the book. Okay, the other thing that you see as a political stress, which is really evident again in the book, is that there's a fear of the rangers, the forest rangers. People are really scared on both sides of getting caught by the rangers, who are incredibly corrupt and therefore very prone to get some fairly large informal fines and so on. And you hear stories from the villagers that they are more scared of the rangers than they are of the pirates who actually, or dacoits as they're called in that area, who kind of will capture them and steal money from them. So they trust them even more than they trust the forest rangers. So that gives a picture, and it's still pretty much the case. The other thing about the book is it talks a lot about how, with all this vulnerability, how the people actually got really organized, and they would do things like, building walls. In this case, they're sort of building a mud barrier to stop the impacts of the floods. If you go to and all of this is really evident that you get this sort of situation where people are actually planting mangroves and other species to sort of protect the surges. Now, of course, that's limited when you get surges that are 10 meters or even higher, but at least it gives you some protection. So all of this sort of collaborative behavior is really strong. And that's strongly there in the book. And it's incredibly obvious when you're there, the amount of energy that goes into people who are very poor with doing all sorts of, kind of mutual benefit. I've got about 2 minutes, haven't I? Yeah. Who are doing all sorts of things at mutual benefit and so forth. So I think that's really a significant aspect. They do reforestation. They also have poverty projects, poverty reduction projects and so on. There's too much. I haven't got time to go into any of that. But what I think is really most interesting part about it is that it's kind of multi-ethnic. So obviously the main population on the Bangladesh side is Muslim. On the Indian side, it's mainly Hindu, but there's also indigenous people who actually go into the forest on a legal basis with permits to collect honey and so forth. And one of the things that's talked about in the book is this idea of a religion, which is an amazing mixture of them, where the rituals are often Hindu, the characters are often Muslim, and yet it's all inspired by the concept of an indigenous god called Bon Bibi, which means basically forest goddess. So I obviously can't go into that in any detail, but it's an amazingly complex bit of anthropology and so on. So that story, the thing I want to stress about Amitav Ghosh is that he is a great storyteller, but he's also he does great research. He is in fact an anthropologist, so that's one for the good guys. He did a PhD in Oxford, and I think his research was in Egypt actually. But he wrote this book called Jungle Nama, which is based on this epic that was written in a sort of a combination of languages, with all these influences about the sort of the myth of the jungle goddess, right? That's just recently been published, but the story's also in the book. The other thing I want to mention here is that there's a book here called that I've read called Forest of Tigers. I think June's reading it, or thinking of reading it. And it's written by an anthropologist called Anu Jalai, who is an Indian expatriate. And it's about the culture and the politics and so on of these mangrove forests. So it's the book is amazingly well informed. And I think that there's three quick things that I didn't mention that I have learned. One is I learned or reinforced, maps are not permanent. When you start looking at a map of this, when the islands pop up over, within a single year and so on, the concept of a permanent map is pretty meaningless. Secondly, how closely poverty is linked to vulnerability and how much that's linked to geography, who occupies which land. And the other one is about the flexibility of religions. All these purist religions are not purist anymore. So the thing I want to sort of stress here is just how valuable it is that your thinking starts to get inspired by this, but also I would like to think it's worth talking about how useful that might be for teaching. So I'll close this one.
So because this is a panel, we'll jump through all the presentations and then come back to questions at the end. I'm not quite sure why this is not.
Loh, bukannya June kenapa jadi Sophie? Bukannya June.
So we are sharing slides. Is that not obvious, Melissa? Yeah, I've just got a chat here from, I'm not, Melissa, is that not working?
It doesn't actually have the full screen.
Can you not see it? It's not full screen now. It's full screen for us on,
Yeah, no, it's,
Are you?
we can read it though.
I can't really hear what, if maybe if you could type into the chat if it's a problem, because I can't really hear you talking right now.
Okay. It's,
All right, we're going to forge ahead with June, I think. It's readable but not ideal as it isn't on slideshow. Okay,
Oh, I
well, so
see.
I'm not quite sure how we'll fix that because it is on slideshow on our
Yeah,
end.
it's really weird.
Oh, maybe is that it? It's okay to read. Oh, is it because you?
Go to the screen there. Slide.
it's okay.
What about that? Do you need the presenter mode?
No.
Is that better? That's is. Okay,
Nice.
great.
Ah,
We figured out the problem. All right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Bob for his idea and bringing us together. Also, Sophie for chairing and Kurt joining us on what I hope will be like a cozy book chat. So I just want to talk about, Amitav Ghost. We initially were so interested in Hungry Tides because for me, I found a lot of resonance in the central character. Have any one of you read The Hungry Tide or any of course, yes, Jeff and Neil. So the main character is a biologist and I think she's from New York and she returns to India. She's from Indian origin and she has like sort of like this duality where she is from the area, but she's really not. So she has all this different sort of like conflicts or sort of interesting viewpoints as she goes along and forges through the story. So I'm glad that Neil talked about it. So I thought, what could I talk about today? And I was thinking of books to talk about. I knew I wanted to talk about a book by an Aboriginal author and like Claire Coleman and her book Terra Nullius was like a no-brainer. And then I thought, okay, I need to also talk about maybe another contemporary book, that was closer to, where I'm from. It's based in Malaysia. When I had these two books together, I didn't realize that there was actually a connection. But before I start, have any one of you read any of these books? Terra Nullius, Claire Coleman. Well, this one just came out. We Could Not See the Stars by Elizabeth Wong. I wish people in the chat, and there's 16 people in the chat, so feel free to also like chat. So it'd be really nice. Oops. So with Terra Nullius, great apologies if you haven't read it because both books, there's like a plot device where you think you're reading a story, you know what's going on, and then there's a twist. The twist is that it's actually not what you think. It's about interstellar or interplanetary colonization or migration. So as you read Terra Nullius, it's a story that may sound familiar to many of us. It's like a retelling of an invasion of Australia in 1788. And for Claire Coleman, she was interested in using speculative fiction as a device because she talked about in an interview, it was a way of being able to talk about things that you weren't able to otherwise talk about. And there's a whole discipline in terms of talking about speculative fiction. It's a site of resistance and how we could use it to highlight present oppressions, past injustice, and potential narratives of self-determination, which is why I feel really drawn to books written by Aboriginal authors and also people of color. Kurt will be talking about two other amazing authors. I also wanted to mention Octavia Butler. Have you read Octavia Butler? So I read it when I was quite young, in the late 1990s, and it blew me away because it was Octavia Butler is Black American, and she wrote this amazing speculative fiction called this Earthseed trilogy. And it's funny because now there's a resurgence for this interest in this author and her books because it's not so speculative as people would say. Things are actually happening. So The books became really popular during the Trump administration because it was really similar to the books that was written, I think, in the 70s and 80s. So that blew me away when I was really, well, not that young reading it, but I didn't have sort of like the knowledge or the tools to sort of conceptualize why I was so drawn to this. And I've always been like a huge reader in many ways. And I read voraciously. I read a lot of bad sci-fi, like Robert Jordan, I mean, like all kinds, Pierce Anthony. But then I eventually grew and to as an understanding as a reader to read, better books from other authors. So Terra Nullius is I mean, it's amazing. It's about it's drawing on themes that we are very familiar with. And then you think you know what's going on. It's about, the Aboriginals being colonized and maybe in a, speculative future in Australia, but it's actually something else. And it's interesting for Claire Coleman. She wanted to write, she said in an interview that she did, she talked about wanting to have readers be tricked to understand what it means to be colonized. So, the device was that it's actually aliens in the end invading Earth. And Australia was the last country that they colonized because it was the driest country in the world that was left. So there was, similar themes that we're very familiar with. There was a lot of ecological devastation because the aliens couldn't survive. They came from a very amphibious state, so they needed more water. So they did a lot of damage on the Australian continent by building all these canals, which actually dried up more of the waterbed. So these are also similar themes that we can understand, but made it in a way that then you realize something else was going on. And you had really interesting characters. Of course, there's characters like the young natives, Jackie and Esperance. But then you also had different perspectives on the settlers or the alien settlers. So you had Sister Bagra, which is, I guess, a more typical, she plays she's a nun in the story, and she has so much contempt for the natives. And she talks about how they have no culture, we're there to civilize them. So these are very similar themes. But then you also have other characters like Johnny Star, who is a settler, and then he was brought in to kill the natives, and then realized as he goes along that these were not animals, but actual people or people that he could relate to. So he has this own forthcoming. So in reading Terra Nullius, readers, of course, to rethink nature of these crimes that are often taken for granted. I had a conversation earlier over the weekend where, people think, well, colonization in Australia is inevitable. If it's not the British, it would be the French and so on. But when we're forced to rethink about what does it actually mean to people who have to endure these oppressions? But also caveat, is anyone familiar with criticism on The Handmaid's Tale about Margaret Atwood? Or are you familiar with the book itself? So The Handmaid's Tale was written by Margaret Atwood, I think in the late 70s or 80s, and it talked about the oppression of women. And then there's a whole revival of this book because it was made into a TV show and people felt like, well, especially with what's going on in the States, they thought they could relate to it. But the criticism on The Handmaid's Tale was that Margaret Atwood took inspiration of actual oppressions that happened to Black and Indigenous women in North America and just made the characters white. So there's a caveat of when you want to use it as a device in speculative fiction, and to have readers have a sense of what does it mean to feel this such oppression, you have to be a bit wary. And I think there's a double irony when Aboriginal or maybe Black authors do that sort of thing, because I think they're sort of winking to the readers in some ways. So yeah, it depends, I suppose. We Could Not See the Stars was written by Elizabeth Wong. She's a Malaysian Chinese diaspora. So it's interplanetary, I wouldn't say colonization, it's more like migration. And her inspiration was because as a Chinese Malaysian diaspora who now lives in the UK, she felt a sense of loss because she talked about in an interview where she said, well, I'm a Chinese person, I have a Chinese name, but I can't speak my languages, my native languages. And there's loss there. There's a loss of stories and narratives that she that she feels. And she said, and the reason for this is because, and I understand it also growing up in Malaysia, she talks about how English was seen as like a language of modernization. You know, this is the way of the future if you want a better life. She talks about how she was encouraged by her parents to learn English instead, as opposed to learning even not learning Mandarin, because they felt they wanted her to migrate to the West, which actually happened what she did. But she felt again like this great sense of loss. I was really struck by We Could Not See the Stars because if you read it, it's written in a very Malaysian Chinese dialect. The characters speak very in English, a mixture of English and Malay and Chinese, which is very uniquely Malaysian. And I really enjoy that because you don't often see it. I think for many authors, people of color, I mean, coming from like places like Southeast Asia and such, you feel like if you're writing in English, characters have to write in like, speaking good English, and just sort of subvert that archetype. But it made it so readable and very much engaged in the landscape. So with the story, it's about this young boy in a fishing village whose mother is one of the spirits. And I remember reading it, one of the spirits, and she came from the jungle and she lost all her memories, where she came from, who her family was. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, it's maybe one of the indigenous people. Because I mean, that was my own takeaway, but instead it was a scene that was set where the mother had come from a different planet, and in doing so, in migrating to a new place, like memories had to be lost. I mean, so I don't know if it relates to anyone listening about this, if it relates to you as a fellow migrant or coming from different cultures and having to lose your languages. How that relates to a great sense of loss. So yeah, there was a lot of, I wanted to also, how many minutes do I have?
1 minute.
Oh, okay.
1.5 minutes.
So I just wanted, I wanted to end with just reading from select text from the book. So this is from Claire Coleman. You think you're smarter than us. You think your brains are bigger. You think we can't learn. We know more than you. We have stories and songs. We have art and culture. What do you have? You have guns and fury and hate. The war has so far been about guns and death. When you think we are defeated, the war will change. The next war will be about resilience and survival, culture and art. When that war begins, you will discover you are not well armed. You have no art. Your stories have no power. So the next text I would like to read is from Elizabeth Wong, We Could Not See the Stars. I am not just losing my memory, I'm losing our collective memories. The home world names that I do not have, the home language that I hear in dreams, the stories of our home worlds, of who we are and how we came to be, for we are stardust. We're merely a minuscule physical manifestation of larger processes, planets forming from bits of rock and dust, plants regenerating oxygen, comets and asteroids delivering water, volcanoes spewing oleum, creating homes for humans to find and populate. We are one sentence in a large story, one whose ending has not been written yet. To lose this history is death. But I'd like to also end with Claire Coleman's final thoughts. I have walked my feet ragged to try to get home. I have fought my heart broken to try to get home. You took me from home, you took me from me, because all that I am in my country. Thank you.
Do you have a PowerPoint kit?
Well, I think it should be all in the same. Maybe 30 minutes now.
Was it in June's PowerPoint?
Oh, no, it was in inbox.
Inbox.
Sorry, I didn't realize you had it. Is that right, Bob? Did you put them in there or not?
It's on
Doesn't matter if you
it's on
did.
the memory stick. You have to open it
Oh,
first
right.
on the memory stick.
I don't know how to work.
Just open the folder.
It's hard to do.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, we're good.
Then you share it.
Goodness me.
Cool.
All right.
All right. Look at you. You have it at the PhD. All right. So look, the last set of a couple of books here. And I guess, look, I wanted to talk about two books that are about New York City in different ways. And just, I guess, if I think about like a lot of what my research is about, it's about whether people who live in cities can actually build common cause with one another across their differences and their diversities. And if they can, like, what can they do with that? What kind of action can they take that's going to actually be powerful enough to make their cities more just or more sustainable or whatever? And of course, like these have been, you know, big questions for urban geographers like me for a long, long time, but they're potentially at least getting more pressing as more and more crises come to confront us as urban dwellers in the face of runaway climate change and pandemics and all sorts of other things. And so the question about whether our responses to all of those kind of events are going to actually exacerbate the inequalities and uneven vulnerabilities that we research and know all about, or whether we're going to find other ways to deal with them through solidarity and egalitarian relationships and everything is a good and big question. And I guess what's drawn me to a whole bunch of fiction reading that ends up being about this a little bit is the extent to which I think at least a lot of good critical urban geography is extremely good at interrogating the problems and what's crap, and sometimes less good at imagining what alternatives might look like and thinking about more just and sustainable futures rather than just, you know, I guess endlessly cataloguing the list of inequalities and ills and then patting ourselves on the back for how right we are when things continue to be shit, right? So in that space, like, I mean, like sort of June is mentioning, I think I can see a bunch of authors turning to speculative fiction to try and think other worlds and to think better worlds, not just dystopian futures, but better futures too. And not the ones that I guess I find myself especially drawn to are the ones that aren't necessarily like utopian, that are the kind of Star Trekky, let's imagine the 25th century when we've solved hunger and we can press a button and everything will be fine. But ones that actually do try and imagine a pathway to something better as well, and think about that pathway and those struggles, etc. So there's two books then that I wanted to talk about, as I say, that have floated my boat recently. And like June, there's going to be some spoilers here for those who haven't read these two books. But I'm trying to hold back the big stuff because I'm hoping maybe somebody would be interested to read them too. So the first one I've picked to talk about is this book that just came out in the last year, The City We Became, by a fantasy writer, N.K. Jemisin, who I should say is a very well-credentialed fantasy writer for us geographers here. Actually was awarded the Honorary Geography Prize by the AAG this year, and her work was celebrated at the AAG big annual event that took place. The citation talked about Jemisin's work being grounded in a keen geographical understanding of the world and human societies through a fiction vividly demonstrating the connections to our in our world between the physical environment, society, justice, making her therefore an outstanding recipient of the AAG Honorary Geography Award. So this book, The City We Became, is set in New York, which is where Jemisin lives. So she's a local writing about her town here. And it's a city in the world that's on the cusp of acquiring a soul and becoming a living sort of breathing thing and entity and subject. And because Jemisin's a fantasy writer, that's not a metaphor for anything or whatever. That's actually what's happening. To read a little passage. Great cities, she says, are like other living things being born and maturing and wearing and dying in their turn. Everyone who's visited a real city feels that one way or another. All those rural people who hate cities are afraid of something legit. Cities really are different. They make a weight on the world, a tear in the fabric of reality, like black holes maybe. And more people come in and deposit their strangeness and leave and get replaced by others, and the tear widens. And through this process, this is sort of accretion of life and attachment to a city. The characters go on to explain early in the book. Cities develop a rhythm, a heartbeat that quickens. And so New York is in the process of this gestation, this, becoming an active living thing, joining cities like Sao Paulo and Hong Kong and others that have already been through this process before. And so in a process that is mysterious and never quite explained, it's just taken for granted in the book. The way that this process happens of the city acquiring a soul is that one person becomes the kind of living, breathing spirit of the city, kind of is attuned to its life, acquires the power of its infrastructures and its populations, and kind of help that birthing process. And the reason that this individual, this avatar for the city is kind of required is because cities have an enemy. So like all things that are being, given new life to, there are threats. So again, a character draws an analogy between new life in nature and the new life of the city, that there's an enemy, again, unspecified, existing in another dimension that's there, threatening the city. And here's where I guess some of the sort of analysis and the politics of New York comes in. The enemy hides among the city's parasites, one of our characters tells us. So literally starts to get its, hooks into New York to try and stop this birthing process by inhabiting the bodies of cops who will chase our heroes through the city, by finding a foothold in the creeping presence of chain stores in an increasingly corporate Manhattan, in condominium developments and real estate agencies in gentrifying Brooklyn, and in the Better New York Foundation and its chairperson, Dr. White, who's dedicated to raising the city from its gritty image to the heights of prosperity and progress. So the book sort of opens with this conflict between New York, the avatar, who again, floating my boat, is a kind of 16-year-old African-American street kid who writes graffiti, who suddenly becomes the body of New York, who's chased around and sort of defeats the enemy, but then collapses, not quite. The city doesn't die, but doesn't come through this battle unscathed. And so at this point, what needs to happen is that the 5 boroughs of New York City themselves have to come to New York's aid, and suddenly then avatars appear from all of these 5 different boroughs. And this is where the politics of the book gets really fascinating for me, is that what has to happen is that these 5 folks have to find one another and have to figure out whether they're actually going to try and help out here, or whether they've got anything in common with one another. And again, I don't have time to go into all the details of what happens, but at least wanted to say a few things about what is especially interesting here for me. Because I guess some of the reviews of this book are, complaining it's quite didactic in its portrayal of the city as this amazing space, and the enemy is this, white gentrifying force of capital, and people who don't like that analysis are finding the book beating them over the head, and people who are comfortable with that analysis just love the book. But what is much, I think, great about the book is that it also tries to complicate that sort of simple battle in all sorts of ways. So the avatar for the Bronx, for instance, is a descendant of the Lenape people, and has railed against the fact that on the one hand, has been put in this position of having to defend the city, but on the other hand, can talk about the history of displacement and colonization of Native American tribes in the process of urbanization, and that's a challenge that defenders of the city have to reckon with. And she's not sure whether she wants to stand up for New York City at that point. Similarly, another character talks about the lives that cities take, as well as the lives that they sustain, which becomes a kind of metaphor for environmental destruction and a kind of urban ecological take on what cities are as they become living, and the kind of parasitic nature of that life in some ways on other environments. And as I say, thirdly, just the fact that there are moments when all of these characters are like, fuck Manhattan, right? Or I hate Staten Island because they're all racist Republicans or whatever. So all these characters trying to figure out whether they're going to get along. As Queens says at one point, I can't become Queens. I'm not even a US citizen. She's an Indian master's student who's staying with relatives while studying at a university there. I hate this city. And that's the irony of this whole affair. Me, part of New York, it's bullshit, such bullshit. But I guess I've lived here for like a third of my life, and my family's hopes are still all tied up in me being successful here, so I can't leave it either. So I'm not going to now tell you what happens. Read the book. Do they win? Blah, blah, blah. But it is the first of a trilogy of books, apparently, so we can expect more from Jemison in that trilogy. And so, look, the other book that I'll just talk about briefly, how long have I got now? How many minutes? A couple of minutes. So is written by somebody also about New York, written by somebody in this case who's not a New Yorker, who wanted to write a book about climate futures and cities. And in interviews has said, I don't live in New York, but if I was going to write a book about climate and cities, then New York is obviously the greatest city on the planet. So I had to write about it, which I know a lot of us urban geographers who are not New Yorkers might take issue with. But anyway, this is a really different model of speculating on the city and, you know, I guess its politics as well as its futures. So Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote this book, has been like a National Science Foundation writer in residence in Antarctica, and has actually collaborated with a lot of academics over the course of his career. He's collaborated with geologists, writing a series about the terraforming of Mars. He's collaborated with our political economy here, Dick Bryant, on this book, imagining sort of different political economic futures, and gave the Wheelwright lecture here actually earlier this year. So long story short, this imagines a New York City in 2140 where there have been two great pulses of sea level rise that have meant that now the shoreline of Manhattan is located somewhere about the what's currently 30th and 40th streets, about halfway up Manhattan over the course of a century. So it's all taking existing climate science about buttresses in you know, great glaciers in the Antarctic and imagining what would happen if they melt, and then thinking what will happen to cities in that context. But super long story short, what's already happening is that through a whole bunch of adaptations, we've got right up in the high ground, new skyscrapers where the rich are sort of hanging on to incredibly precious real estate. We've got the intertidal zone that is now being squatted by a whole bunch of, you know, anarchists and people who've been displaced because it's dangerous because the tide washes through. And then we've got lower Manhattan here, which has become a kind of, you know, Venice type arrangement. The book is full, firstly, of just a whole bunch of really well-informed imaginaries of what it would be to keep a city going in that context, which for the technical side of it is just super fun to read. But the politics also here is super interesting. This is now, again, having had all this sort of sweat equity go into the intertidal areas and the lower Manhattan areas. It's all been done by cooperatives who've, you know, basically squatted the property that was abandoned. Is now kind of being gentrified. The forces of capital are moving in, acting just like the floodwaters, as one of the characters put it. So just liquidity as being a thing of, you know, that's played on in this book, that's financial as well as aquamarine, as it were. And so the question of how these folks are going to fight against the forces of capital trying to displace them from their lovely new neighborhoods is something that is worked through in this book. And again, as usual with Kim Stanley Robinson, all the conflict is brought to a head because there's a giant storm that wipes away a lot of this development. People are displaced. They go and try and occupy some of the vacant rich people's housing up in the cloisters in northern Manhattan. The same security guards who are defending the gentrified property developers in the lower Manhattan are defending what's going on up there. And then the tenants union calls a debt strike, which basically becomes a kind of replay of the 2008 global financial crisis. But rather than people not paying their debts because they can't, they organize to withdraw their cooperation from debt as a way of trying to interrupt the influence of finance in inequality in the city. And again, I won't spoil the ending by telling you how that metropolitan strike goes. So yeah, those are the two books. I'll stop there so that we've got time for a bit of discussion.
All right, thanks, Kurt. So there's someone here asking questions on chat or doing something. So I'll just, Nicola. All right. You can read that question. Jean, would you comment? Yeah. Comment. Did you want to respond to that?
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Yeah. Thanks for adding.
If anyone in the room would like to ask a question or relate their own experiences with fiction, please go ahead. Anne.
Just wanted to say thank you. Fantastic presentations. Kim Stanley Robinson also has a PhD, so he's got an academic background as well. He's also a scientist as well. One of the commenters mentioned Australian connection. I've got, just to relate a personal experience, where I fell in love with speculative fiction at the age of 12 when I read The Sydney Star by Arthur C. Clarke. Very white, very British. but I wrote to him and told him that I loved the story. It's basically very briefly about two cities left on a very proto environment fiction or eco fiction. One of them is a smart city gone mad, and this is him writing in the 50s, and the other one is kind of like an eco city. And there's an underground disused railway tunnel connecting the two that was used for millennia. But the thing that I found interesting, when he wrote back, he said he wrote most of it in Sydney. So he was here in Sydney in the 1950s, and he wrote most, he wrote it in Sydney and here in the island, but it was actually inspired by the Sydney Railway Network. So there's that urban connection, which is why I love that. And just very briefly, I don't want to keep everyone, but my modest contribution to this is a co-edited volume on collecting climate fiction that we ask researchers to historicise their research. So it's a result of a collaboration with Karen O'Brien and a few other collaborators. We're going for a second round. So this will be a competition, and we want people to, so if you do have a story in you, a good story, as Sophie said at the outset, this is a story about stories. There are some fantastic contributions, and we would love to, I'll maybe speculate the call later, but I love Octavia as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Anne. That's great. Anybody else?
So just to pick up on that, I suppose so I know there was a book that came out about a year or so ago about speculative fiction on sort of smart cities. That was just a series of very short, fictional essays. And I tried writing on the first master, right? Which came out and imagined what would happen if Apple got control of the city and fun with that. But it just did make me realize that, obviously, it's not my skill set. But so, yeah, I think what Kim Stanley Robinson particularly seems to be doing really interesting one. It's actually somebody who, as you say, is has a PhD, the work that British Embassy is PhD supervisor. I mean, write books, but it's just collaborating. And so, yeah, sort of had some chats with Nick about that process. And yeah, it's sort of, rather than us trying to do it ourselves, I suppose, actually collaborating with, visual artists, collaborating with fiction writers, etc., who could actually do a much better job of it. It seems to me, at least in my case, trying to do it more. How to do this stuff.
So Linda Connor online has a question. Linda, would you like to we'll see how we go with our tech, but ask away.
Oh, okay. Can I be heard? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, look, I was just reflecting. Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, once made a comment about doing ethnographic field work and being in an unfamiliar place and experiencing it intensely. And he talked about the irony of field work, where you're in that place and you're living there as if you're never going to go away, because that's sort of the premise of how you understand everyday life, in a unfamiliar setting. And then of course you do leave, but you've had this transformative experience, both intellectually and in other ways, of experiencing another world. And I suppose, having read 3 of the books that you all spoke about, that's the experience I had in reading those books, in a way where you enter a world and it's a deeply emotionally engaging world, as well as an intellectually challenging world. And that's, the achievement of these different authors that you chose. And then you come away from it. And I mean, it's different to, say, reading a geography or an anthropology book or article, I think, where you don't have quite that intensity of emotional engagement in this world that's been created, because that we don't really try professionally to create worlds in the same way in our writing. But I suppose the question to each of you is, what emotions did you come away with, or did you experience and come away with that you feel were transformative about these books and about your experience of these books for yourselves. That's over and above the sort of, the intellectual stimulation that obviously is there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Did you guys want Oh, Linda's just wondering what kind of emotional experience you had or was inspired in you by reading of the book, in addition to the above and beyond the kind of intellectual connection that you made with it. Is that a good quick?
Yeah, that's fair enough. Sorry, I didn't realize I couldn't be heard very well.
No, it's where our technology is
Yeah.
less than optimal, but some of us can hear you. Yes, go ahead, Bob. Okay, sure.
I mean, that's a very good question, Linda. I guess my sense is that it's the emotional response, say, to the Hungry Tide, is that, when I read it, it's a very emotional book. You become really engaged at all of the character. The thing is that the characters are very realistic. They're all people that you sort of have a sympathy for. So I think that it's not sort of a separate thing from the intellectual reaction. It's just that the fact that it is kind of an emotional experience to be reading it, like all good fiction, is what actually triggers the excitement. So I just don't think I could separate the fact that I'm intellectually excited by an incredibly amazing picture of an amazing environment, but it's the impacts on what happens to the people in it that make it actually really, really gripping. Particularly one of the characters who's never actually, he's reported through a notebook that he has written 20 years before. He's the person that has all this engagement with the people massacred on the island, and it's sort of, when you realize that that part of it's all true, and you can see the impacts of the flooding and everything, and the challenges of living in the place, and they're realistic characters. I think you just can't separate an emotional impact from essentially an intellectual challenge, I suppose. Yeah. It's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's the general idea.
Do you want to respond to
Thank you, Linda, for your question. So emotional response for Terra Nullius, I think I read it when it first came out, so that was in 2017. But I guess I remembered my first impressions was that I was really impressed. I think it was a really skillful book, the way that she carried it off. Not to give anything away again, but if you were to read, like, for example, each chapter, there would be like sort of like a vignette of like, for example, a newsy type where it sort of sets up the scene of the chapter. So it's like, I thought it was quite brilliant in the way that she investigated. She obviously did a lot of research into the book. I don't know where to look at myself. A lot of research that went into the book, but also her own embodied experience as a Noongar woman. I could imagine. So just to see that carried out. I mean, I especially liked how Kurt reiterated about how, as academics, you feel like you're cataloging all the bad stuff that's happening to minoritized or marginalized populations or areas. And fiction is it's a way to sort of not necessarily escape, but to be reminded of like the different features that people are already dreaming of or already actually just living, and that we just have to see. So when we could not see the stars, I was excited to read a book, as I talked about, in a very Malaysian Chinese dialect, how they were speaking. And I mean, obviously it was an emotional book for the author to write. I mean, in terms of loss of native languages, which I also could relate. Not so much it was so imposed onto you, like, but rather of like generational, not generational loss, but rather of like thinking you have to speak English, it doesn't matter that you don't speak your native languages very well or at all, because it's just the way to live in the world. And I think that's just such a sad thing that I think a lot of people are going back and saying, we want to reclaim our cultures and heritage. So that was quite emotional. But I did feel, the one critique I had about Elizabeth Wong's book is that in writing her story, she had to write off, like not write about the native populations in West Malaysia, the Orang Asli, or I don't remember whether she mentioned the Malays, but not to talk about them. And I mean, that was a choice that she made, but I thought it was, for me, it was sort of weird because she talked about like the loss of languages in some ways, or like the loss of culture. But to express that, she also didn't talk about an actual, like, I mean, actual cultures and peoples who are currently still living in West Malaysia. So yeah, they were very emotional, I guess, in different levels. And it's really great to read books by minoritized authors, particularly Aboriginal First Nations. And yeah, any emotions.
So, yeah, I don't know. So super quickly, just looking at the time, like the two books have been quite different for me in that respect. Like the New York 2140 thing, I'm almost feel like carrying it around in my back pocket, like literally sometimes you can see there's a whole bunch of notes. I'm trying to like write about this crazy book as well. But because, yeah, I guess it feels like to me it was a bit recharging in the sense of pushing against a perfect being the enemy of a good kind of environmental politics, really, like telling a bit of a story of what's happened in 140 years and the gains and the losses and the gains and the losses and the struggles that is neither dystopian nor utopian and not hopeless and not naively optimistic, was just actually, I found intellectually has, yeah, set me off in a slightly different direction with some of my research and the partnerships I'm trying to work on in the community here in Sydney on that stuff. And the city we became, it's actually like, I'm being that annoying person who's just read a really good book and like have almost, I think, organized a little reading group actually in the Sydney Alliance space, because it speaks to so much of what is going on there when a whole bunch of us are trying to forge common agendas across like about 50 different partner organizations and struggling with the, how do you make that work? And then here's a novel that dramatizes that in a really fun and interesting way. And so, yeah, I've become a very annoying, we're all going to read this book, everybody, and it's going to be awesome kind of guy. But it is. So yeah,
I think
that's how
that
it's working.
to Leslie's
Leslie's,
question
yeah.
as well. Yeah. I just wanted to say quickly, Linda, before we wrap up, that your question really reminded me of a response to that sociology book that Alice Goffman wrote a few years ago called On the Run, in which she's done this amazing ethnography in Chicago, and she kind of, in pursuit of anonymity, kind of mixes these stories up and confuses these timelines a little bit, almost kind of fictionalizes what happens, but still based on her experiences. And there was a lot that is problematic about the book, but the response was kind of fairly damning about that kind of misrepresentation or supposed misrepresentation of what happened. And so I think there's kind of interesting questions about academics working with fiction and their responsibility to their research participants and so on, but kind of in that story too, which is kind of interesting. So it's 1 minute past 2, and I think that takes us to time. Thank you for your patience on Zoom, folks. We really appreciate it, and thanks for people's comments and questions as well. We have read them and we have mostly heard what you've been saying. So thanks again, and thanks everyone for joining us.